Hello, everyone, and welcome back to True Crime Guru. Just a quick thank you to everyone who has recently subscribed, and a reminder to please subscribe if you have not already. You can also find the channel on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, so go ahead and give us a follow on there. I am also in the dire need of case suggestions, so please do not hesitate to hit me up on social media, or you can email your suggestion to truecrimeguruchannel@gmail.com. Today, I will be discussing the disappearance of 26-year-old Marshal Iwaasa, who was last seen alive leaving a storage facility on November 18th, 2019, in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. 5 days later, Marshal's truck would be located about 1,200 kilometers or 745 miles away in a very remote part of British Columbia. The truck, however, was found completely burned, leaving everyone to wonder what happened to Marshal Iwaasa. Just a quick warning, today's episode does touch on the subject of suicide, so please proceed with caution. By all accounts, Marshal Iwaasa would have been the gentlest person you would have ever met. He was raised by his mother, Tammy Johnson, in Lethbridge, Alberta, which is located in the southern part of the province, about an hour away from the U.S. border in Montana. Tammy and Marshal's father had divorced while he was still a baby, so growing up, it was just Marshal, his mom, and his sister Paige. And as far as I can tell, Marshal's father had remained out of the picture. Paige and Marshal were only about 3.5 years apart and had always been incredibly close. Although during childhood, they had kind of deviated from the traditional brother and sister dynamic. Usually, you would see the brother teasing and picking on his sister, but it was the opposite for Paige and Marshal. According to Paige, Marshal was so sweet and gentle, and she was definitely the more abrasive one, even going as far to say, quote, "I would joke that I had sucked up all the aggression in the womb," end quote. But despite this, Paige and Marshal would remain incredibly close, even into adulthood. I can definitely relate to this myself. My sister and I are the same number of years apart as Paige and Marshal, and just like them, we are incredibly close, and we also have matching tattoos just like Paige and Marshal. Growing up, Marshal was extremely athletic, playing both football and rugby. Although Tammy did tell the Vanish podcast in 2020 that one time Marshal had stated that he did not want to play football anymore because he was not comfortable with hurting others, which really speaks to Marshal's gentle nature. He was also quite the outdoorsman. He loved being out in nature and would go camping every chance that he got. Once they had reached adulthood, Paige had relocated to Hawaii, and she would occasionally travel back to Canada here and there. But Marshal made sure to spend Christmas with her in Hawaii every year. Their birthdays were also around this time, with Paige's being at the end of December and Marshal's being January 3rd. So he would usually stick around to celebrate their birthdays as well. With Paige gone, Marshal started to branch out and try to find his foot in the world. He had usually kept a small, close circle of friends and was living with them in Lethbridge after high school. It was also during this time that Marshal got really into bodybuilding, which, you can totally tell by just looking at him. And he was able to gain some friends through this as well. He had been picking up work here and there in the gas and electric industry, which is very prevalent in this region. But Marshal did not want to do this extremely physically demanding work his whole life. So he ultimately decided to go to school. Marshal was said to be very tech savvy, so he was looking for something in the information technology field, and had decided on the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology, which had required him to make the move to the much bigger city of Calgary, which is about 2 hours away from his hometown in Lethbridge. He had started school there in the fall of 2018 and was studying computer programming. While in Calgary, Marshall had been renting a basement unit from a family and had kept a small circle of friends there as well. He was a pretty busy guy. I mean, he had school to focus on, and he was still picking up work that sometimes required him to travel to desolate areas that didn't have the best cell coverage. So it wasn't unusual to not hear from Marshall for a few days. And everyone knows that once you become an adult, it becomes harder to stay in touch in general. But Paige had started to notice in 2019 that she was hearing from Marshall less. But she just figured that he was busy, and he was a super private person anyway, so, again, it really wasn't that out of the ordinary. However, she did start to worry that something was going on that Marshall didn't want to talk about. Marshall started the day on Sunday, November 17th, 2019, doing pretty normal Sunday stuff. Cleaning, doing laundry. You guys know how that goes. Well, that evening, Tammy had asked Marshall to come down to Lethbridge because she was having some kind of computer trouble. And with Marshall being a computer wizard, she needed his help. So he had hopped in his 2009 GMC Sierra and made the 2-hour trek to Lethbridge. According to Tammy, Marshall was acting just like himself. He did not seem agitated or upset and wasn't acting like he was in a hurry to get somewhere or anything. It was around 11 p.m. when Marshall was getting ready to leave. Tammy had been pretty persistent in just trying to get Marshall to stay the night. But he was adamant that he was leaving and had said that he, quote, had some stuff to take care of back in Calgary, end quote. It's unclear exactly what Marshall meant by this, but I know how it is when your mom is trying to get you to stay the night, and you're just like, no, Mom, I'm leaving. He had also mentioned that he was planning on stopping by a storage unit that he and Paige had shared to get some computer equipment to take back with him to Calgary. Marshall arrived at the storage facility around 11:30. He had made multiple attempts to get inside using his code. Now, Paige said that when they first rented the facility, it was open 24/7. But I guess they had changed that at some point, and Marshall did not get the memo. So he just kept trying to get in and would take little breaks here and there, maybe looking for the code in his phone or maybe in his truck. Well, Marshall would actually stay at the facility until 6 a.m. when he was finally able to get in. So whatever he was there to retrieve, whether it was computer equipment or something else, he must have really needed it since he waited 6.5 hours. And then the second mystery is Marshall would remain inside the facility for another 2.5 hours before finally leaving at 8:30 on November 18th. This would be the last verifiable sighting of Marshal Iwaasa. Tammy had made a trip out to Hawaii to visit Paige, and as I mentioned, it wasn't abnormal to not hear from Marshall for a few days, since he was so busy. Well, on November 26, 2019, Tammy had received a call from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Pemberton, British Columbia. They had informed her that Marshall's GMC Sierra was located on a service road near the Felix Creek Trail, which is about 1,200 kilometers, or 745 miles for our U.S. peeps, from Lethbridge. According to Tammy, the RCMP really didn't give her much information, and it hadn't really formulated in Tammy and Paige's brains that Marshall might even be missing. They kind of just thought that he was away somewhere for work and that his truck was stolen and that he needed to know. Now, to say where the truck was located is off the beaten path would be a major understatement. In fact, the Felix Creek Trail is super hard to even get to. The road where the truck was found requires a four-wheel drive vehicle. It's super muddy and rocky and has several creeks and potholes. This location is so remote that you cannot even use a GPS to get there. The main reason that anyone would even be here is if they were planning on staying at the Brian Waddington Hut, which is like a lodging place that I think might even be free, but you have to register online in advance if you were planning on staying there. And the only people that were registered was this group of hikers. It's about a 2-hour hike on the trail to the hut. And on November 23rd, 2019, they were doing just that when they located Marshall's GMC Sierra. And here's the kicker. The detail that the RCMP had failed to mention to Tammy was that the truck had been completely torched, which, of course, changes the entire narrative. So much so that the hikers thought that they themselves were in danger. One of them had told Allison Hurst with CTV News, quote, "You start wondering if something nefarious had taken place. It's not like it was just torched. It seemed like it had been severely burned, where the wheels had blown off, the glass had melted. I mean, it was almost unidentifiable." End quote. Alongside the vehicle, the hikers had also noticed a lot of items scattered about, including clothes, 2 passports, several smashed phones, and the shells of an Xbox and PlayStation gaming consoles. The hikers had taken their own photos of the scene and had posted it to a Facebook group dedicated to hikers. The Pemberton Police Service and the British Columbia RCMP could not make it out to the scene for another 2 days, and they, of course, had taken their own photos as well. However, it would later be discovered that there are very distinct differences between the photos taken by the hikers and the photos taken by the RCMP. As you can see from these photos that I obtained from CanadaUnsolved.com, a lot of the items were moved or even possibly taken between November 23rd and November 25th. Which begs the question, who was there during that time? Now, of course, someone may have seen the photos on Facebook and took the opportunity to go steal some stuff. But at the same time, I feel like this place is so hard to get to that even if you were planning on just stealing stuff, it almost wouldn't even be worth it to go there. Which really makes you wonder if someone else had been there for a different reason. Trying to figure all of this out from Hawaii was difficult for Tammy and Paige. But once they knew that the truck had been burned, it was very clear that something was terribly wrong. They had initially reported Marshall missing with the Calgary Police Service, since that is where he lived. However, most of the investigating at this time was being done by the RCMP in British Columbia, since that is where the truck was located. Marshall had no connection to anyone or anything in BC in general, and especially not all the way on this western part of BC. So Tammy and Paige could not figure out why Marshall would have gone there himself. They knew that the last place that Marshall was seen was the storage facility, but unfortunately, by the time Marshall was reported missing, the footage there had been erased. So 3 days into Marshall's disappearance, Tammy and Paige had created the Find Marshal Iwaasa Facebook page and appealed to the public to find any surveillance footage of Marshall or his truck after leaving the storage facility. Where the storage place is located is in a very industrial area, so they were hoping that someone would be able to find something. But unfortunately, no. To this day, Marshall's whereabouts after leaving the storage unit are unknown. There were no transactions on Marshall's bank account after November 15th, 2019, which was 2 days before he went missing. The drive from Lethbridge to where the truck was found is like a 14-hour drive. So obviously, whoever was driving the truck would have needed to stop for gas. And this is a truck we're talking about, and they burn through gas like it is nothing. So a trip like this probably would have required at least 2 or 3 stops, maybe even a fourth. Obviously, if Marshall was the one who was driving, he did not use his bank card. And I feel like even if he had used cash, there would still be some kind of record of him withdrawing that cash from his account. Because, well, for starters, hardly anyone uses cash anymore. And also, gas is not cheap, so he probably would have needed at least $100 to $150 if he were planning on paying that way. The family also believes that if Marshall had used cash to fill up, a gas station clerk would have likely remembered him, since he has a very distinctive look to him, with his various tattoos and his hair. Now, whether or not any investigative agency had attempted to locate surveillance footage from gas stations along that route, I am fairly confident that they did not. Which is a shame, because if you want surveillance footage like that, you have to get it pretty quickly, because oftentimes it is overwritten pretty fast. Most of the items that were scattered around the truck were collected. Both of the passports were verified to be Marshall's. However, one of them was expired. All of the smashed phones were verified to have belonged to Marshall as well. And the family says that Marshall was notorious for breaking his phones, and I think we all know someone like that. So the fact that they were smashed was not surprising. However, all of these were Marshall's old phones, and the one that he was currently using, which was a pearl-colored Samsung Galaxy S6, has never been found. Also missing along with Marshall are his backpack, school-issued laptop, and his wallet. Most of the clothes found at the scene were also Marshall's, and Paige told the Vanished podcast that it was probably about a week's worth of clothes. But some of the items were not Marshall's, including the Xbox and PlayStation shells. Now, Marshall did own both gaming consoles, but Paige would later locate them inside of his apartment. And they don't really look like they had been there previously, so it really makes you wonder who they actually belong to. And I will get into some information I read about this here in a bit. The BC RCMP did search for Marshall in the days following the discovery of the truck. However, they would have to call off the search on December 4th due to weather conditions. And later that same month, they officially handed off the case to the Lethbridge Police Service, since that was the last place that Marshall was seen. The Lethbridge Police Service had made statements that after examining Marshal Iwaasa's financial records and interviewing family and friends, they had found evidence that Marshall was under a lot of stress. They had also discovered that he had not enrolled in the fall semester and had also been placed on academic probation, and that he had also let his cell phone plan lapse. The school thing was only partially surprising to Marshall's family. He had apparently been acting a little weird about the subject in the months leading up to his disappearance. He would avoid or change the subject of school, and had also made statements like he didn't need a degree in the field that he was interested in. Marshall's cousin Kat had also told the Vanish podcast that she wouldn't be surprised if Marshall just simply forgot to pay his phone bill. She said that he wasn't really the type of person who was glued to his phone, so it wouldn't have been a particularly high priority for him. However, all of this did lead the Lethbridge Police Service to tell Tammy that they believe that Marshall committed suicide. And Tammy got the impression that since they believed this, that they weren't really going to take this seriously. They have made statements that the items collected from the truck scene were tested for prints, but nothing usable was found. They have also said that they cannot test for DNA because there is no evidence that something criminal has taken place. But I wonder if they tested for prints, if they can even test for DNA now. I know that a lot of times you can either do one or the other, but if you do one, then it compromises the ability to do the other. So that is something to think about. But there is something that is unique about Canada, and that is that they have what's known as the Missing Persons Act. And what this is essentially a way to protect the privacy of a missing person, regardless of the circumstances of their disappearance. And this makes it difficult for family and even law enforcement to gain access to crucial information such as financial records, medical records, and what have you. In order for law enforcement to gain this type of information and to do additional testing like for DNA, they have to consider the case to be criminal. And the Lethbridge Police Service does not consider Marshal Iwaasa's case to be that at this time. Marshal's family was starting to become really frustrated with law enforcement and decided to hire their own private investigators. In June of 2020, an extensive search was conducted that included the PIs, the RCMP, the Lethbridge Police Service, and several private search and rescue organizations. This was also the first time that the RCMP had brought in a fire investigator to determine the cause of the fire, which is absolutely baffling that it took them 7 months to do this. The RCMP had stated that they did not previously bring in a fire investigator because there was no evidence that anyone besides Marshal was present when the truck was set ablaze. I believe that the results of the RCMP's fire investigation were inconclusive, but the family did bring in their own fire investigator to do an assessment. He had spoken with the TV show Never Seen Again, which is on Paramount Plus, and he had stated that he concluded that the cause of the fire was arson, which, of course, is no surprise. He said what led him to this determination was the fact that the fire did not originate in the engine. In fact, he was able to determine that the fire originated in the passenger seat. And one of the things that led him to this was an open Zippo lighter that was located in the middle console. What we do not know is what type of accelerant was used to start the fire. But just like with the mystery of Marshall stopping for gas, if he had stopped and got gas to start the fire or any other type of accelerant, there would probably be evidence of that. The private investigation team told Tammy that after conducting their searches, they were confident that Marshall was no longer in the area. They felt like if there had been a body there, they would have found it. Marshall's family has searched far and wide and have considered all the options as to what may have happened to him. But without his remains, the questions regarding his whereabouts remain unanswered. The Lethbridge Police Service seemed to be pretty convinced that Marshal Iwaasa committed suicide. However, they have not said what evidence they have collected that led them to this determination. Is it just simply the fact that Marshall had not re-enrolled into school and had been acting kind of elusive? Or did they find something else that led them to this determination? Tammy and Paige said that they have considered this possibility and it is not completely off the table. Marshall had been showing signs that he was stressed out and has always been an extremely private person, so any internal demons he may have been fighting would be unknown. But if Marshall had committed suicide, then, for one, where is his body? And why would he drive 14 hours away to a place that he had no connection to just to commit suicide? Like I mentioned, you cannot use a GPS to get to this location, so I feel like there would have been some kind of electronic record of Marshall searching for this area. There also would be little to no reason for Marshall to have set his truck on fire if he was not going to be here. He also did not leave a note behind, which is almost always the case in suicides. Tammy and Paige have also said that he had not previously shown any signs of suicidal ideation or had any previous suicide attempts. So if you factor all of this together, the likelihood that Marshall had committed suicide doesn't seem very high. then of course there is the possibility that Marshall had left to start a new life somewhere. But that kind of raises the same questions that suicide does. Some believe that he may have devised this elaborate plan to travel to BC, burn his truck, and then take off, therefore staging his own disappearance. And the fact that some of his more important items, like his phone and his backpack, have never been recovered, does give some credence to this. But where would he have gone? The U.S. border was notified of Marshall's disappearance, and there is no record of him legally entering the United States. But then again, Canada itself is massive, and there are ample places for him to hide out there. Oftentimes, in missing persons cases, we always hear about this idea of people, especially men, wanting to live off the grid in the wilderness. And Marshall was an avid outdoorsman, and the location where his truck was located was extremely remote. But according to Page, all of Marshall's camping gear and the items that he would have needed to do this were still located inside the storage unit. But he was at the storage unit for 2.5 hours, and to this day, it is unknown what exactly it was that he retrieved from there. Also, it is reasonable to think that all of his clothes that were left behind at the truck, he probably would have taken with him if he were planning to run away. Another mystery to add to this case is Marshall's Snapchat. Like a lot of grieving families do, Marshall's loved ones had been sending messages to his Snapchat. Well, there is a record of a number of these snap messages being opened. Now, some might say that this is just a fluke, but as an avid Snapchat user myself, I find that to be unlikely. I have snap messages that I have sent to people that have shown as delivered for like years. Now, of course, I do not have the comprehensive Snapchat data, but in my personal experience, the accuracy of someone either opening or ignoring your snaps is pretty on point. Which begs the question, is it Marshall opening these snaps or someone else? Possibly someone who have caused him harm. I think the likelihood that Marshal Iwaasa was met with foul play is pretty high. For starters, his truck was set on fire, and I can't think of any good reason for Marshall to have done this himself. I believe I mentioned this during my episode about the unsolved murder of Leon Morales, but anytime a body, a vehicle, or a home is set on fire in cases like this, it is almost always as a measure to conceal evidence. And the only reason to conceal evidence is if the perpetrator themselves were inside the vehicle. Marshall's cousin Kat had told the Vanish podcast that there had been reports of carjackings and car kidnappings in Lethbridge. Like many cities in North America, Lethbridge had been plagued by the opioid epidemic, and there had been a substantial increase in crime in the years leading up to Marshall's disappearance. In 2020, Lethbridge was listed as being Canada's 15th most dangerous city, with most of the crimes being drug-related. Now, I'm going to circle back to those empty Xbox and PlayStation shells that were found by the truck. Just a quick disclaimer, I am getting into Reddit territory here, so keep that in mind. When I was reading a Reddit thread about Marshall's disappearance, a lot of the commenters had mentioned that empty gaming shells are a very popular method for transporting various contraband. Drugs, cash, whatever. We know that the gaming consoles did not belong to Marshall, and as I mentioned, it didn't really look like they had been there prior to the truck being left there. So this really opens up the possibility of Marshall being carjacked by someone in Lethbridge, and then either being killed while still in Lethbridge, or literally anywhere on the 1,200 kilometer route. And the location where the truck was burned is definitely an ideal place to conduct some kind of illegal activity. Now, some have speculated that Marshall himself was involved in such activity, but I personally find those kinds of accusations to be irresponsible, especially when you consider that these types of carjackings had been occurring. Marshall had no criminal record, and as far as I know, there was no evidence that he was involved with anything having to do with the drug trade. He was also at that storage unit for over 6 hours, which gave ample time for some loser to spot him and carry out some kind of sinister plot. I also want to bring back up the whole needing cash to pay for gas thing. A lot of people involved in the drug trade usually have cash on them. So that is another thing to take into consideration when considering this theory. This is, of course, the most pessimistic theory regarding Marshall's disappearance, especially since if he was murdered, his remains could literally be anywhere. 4.5 years have passed since 26-year-old Marshal Iwaasa was last seen at a storage facility in Lethbridge, Alberta. Marshall's GMC Sierra had remained at that location until late 2023 because it was impossible for law enforcement to remove it due to the terrain. However, a private organization had taken it upon themselves to dismantle the truck and dump it in a landfill. According to Tammy, no one from the organization had reached out to her to ask how she would feel about this. She was disheartened to learn that the truck had been removed because she had considered that location to be Marshall's final resting place and was hoping to one day put up a memorial there. A spokesperson from the organization had told Jeanette Rocher with the Bridge City News that he wished that he had reached out first and that he would happily help Tammy put up a memorial if he was asked. Marshall's loved ones are still fighting to have this case treated as a criminal investigation and have started a petition to have this classification changed. Having this case treated as criminal would allow for further investigation, such as DNA testing, and further access to documents that could be crucial to filling in these missing pieces. I ask that you take a moment of your time to sign this petition. It would mean the world to Marshall's loved ones. I also ask that you keep them in your thoughts and prayers and hold out hope that they will one day find out what happened to their precious Marshall. I know that I will. At the time of his disappearance, Marshal Iwaasa was 26 years old and would today, in May of 2024, be 31. He stood 5 feet and 11 inches tall and weighed about 170 pounds. Marshall had many distinctive tattoos and usually kept his shoulder-length brown hair in a bun or wrapped in a toque. He was last seen wearing a green hoodie, a gray toque, black pants, and red high-top shoes. Missing along with Marshall are his phone, which is a pearl-colored Samsung Galaxy S6, his wallet, which is described to be a Nixon wallet with a screen, as well as his backpack and Southern Alberta Institute of Technology issued laptop. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Marshal Iwaasa, please contact the Lethbridge, Alberta Police Service at 403-328-4444. You can also always tip anonymously with Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477. Or you can submit a tip online at p3tips.com. If you are currently experiencing thoughts and feelings of suicide or self-harm, help is available. Please reach out to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. For those of you outside of the U.S., please reach out to your local crisis center. Your life matters. Thank you everyone for watching, and I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. I will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode and case. In the meantime, I ask that you please subscribe and turn on notification. You can also find the channel on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I'm also in dire need of case suggestions, so please do not hesitate to hit me up on the socials or you can email your suggestion to truecrimeguruchannel@gmail.com. Thank you, everyone, and please stay safe.